Good afternoon, everybody. I would like to invite you to our closing keynote. Asaf Bartov is a senior program officer at the Wikimedia Foundation, the nonprofit operating Wikipedia around the world. His work focuses on capacity building with emerging volunteer communities all over the world, with particular emphasis on India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil, and Eastern Europe. While his academic background is in Greek and Latin language and literature, he has a strong professional background in software development and an abiding volunteer interest in digital libraries. He is the founder, chief technologist, and chief editor of Project Ben Yehuda, an award-winning volunteer-run digital library of public domain Hebrew works. He is also a structured and linked data enthusiast and previously served as an invited expert on the W3C's Library Linked Data Incubator Group. He frequently teaches introductory classes on Wikidata, the Wikimedia Foundation's Linked Open Data Project, and on querying Wikidata with the Sparkle language. Asaf's talk is titled Free Culture at the Periphery. The Wikimedia movement, I'm gonna actually skip that because he's just gonna talk about his talk. We don't need to go through that. But on a more personal note, I really want to thank you so much for teaching us 2 workshops on Monday, for staying for the entire conference, because I can tell you, in my entire career, I have never heard of a keynote staying for an entire conference. For jumping into our community and creating a collaboration document for us. I sincerely hope that you feel welcomed by our community, because it's really been a true pleasure and a true honor having you join us this week. So thank you. With that, Asaf.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I stayed because this is interesting stuff, not out of politeness. And while I set up, I'm curious about the results. Were they announced? I mean, the suspense is killing me. All right. Okay. So let me set up here real quick. In the meantime, you can admire. Yeah.
I'd like to be able to see you.
Yes, absolutely. You can admire my friend Alkes, the Wikidata Moose. He's traveling the world with me, teaching Wikidata wherever he goes. And he will be supervising this keynote. There we go. He is also a member of the Wikimedia Cuteness Association, a group of dedicated plush toys traveling the world and spreading free knowledge wherever they go. All right. So thank you, Aviva, for the introduction. Thank you to the program committee for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be here. And I am an outsider to this community. I'm not a library professional, repository professional. I am a professional technologist, but I'm on hiatus from that profession for the last 7 years. I've been working for the Wikimedia Foundation. That is the nonprofit that operates Wikipedia around the world, where my job does not involve programming. So that has become a hobby. And so I chose to title my talk, Free Culture at the Periphery, a personal perspective, because I feel that is both all I can give you, but also what I want to give you. I'm trying to make good on the implicit promise in the 2 main hats under which I was invited, those of a free culture activist and that of a Wikimedia professional working with a lot of communities around the world. So there is going to be a segue that I tried to make not too awkward in the middle of the talk. See if you can spot it. So, is this working? Almost. Okay. Yeah, so I'm pleased to meet you. A few words about me, in addition to what was already said, is I'm a native Hebrew speaker. Do I get points for diversity for that? And I've been a volunteer with Wikipedia since 2001. That's the year Wikipedia was founded in English. So it's been a while, and I still am a Wikipedia volunteer, writing articles, editing the wiki in my spare time. But I've also turned Wikimedia work into my day job 7 years ago, working for the foundation, where, like I said, I'm a program officer working with our volunteer communities. I'm not paid to edit Wikipedia on the job. I'm also an accidental digital librarian, which is what makes this conference interesting for me. And I founded several nonprofits. I develop free software for fun, not so much for profit. And I'm a lapsed classicist, as was mentioned. This has nothing to do with anything. I'm just guilting myself by reminding myself of it. So I do want to say a few words about how I got here, considering I'm not a library professional. And it starts with this man, Michael S. Hart, founder of Project Gutenberg. I trust you've all heard of Project Gutenberg. If you haven't, it's a project creating and sharing e-texts, digital files containing texts, started in 1971 on room-sized computers and on stolen computer time. But this man had the vision of using computers for sharing texts just because we can, because computers can do that very easily. Even in the 70s, it wasn't too hard to transmit some text over the network, such as it was. And he collected around him a group of volunteers who responded to and shared that vision. And all this was happening in the faraway United States. I mean, in this here United States, but I was in Israel at the time, far away. And they've been at it for years, much accelerating with the late 80s and the early BitNet internet networks. And through releasing those texts to the public and some unknown magic, a CD-ROM in 1991, do you remember those? A CD-ROM arrived at my house with a friend who said, "You've got to see this. You're not going to believe what's on this CD-ROM." And that was a third-party CD-ROM. I'm pretty certain Michael Hart didn't even know this thing exists. It's some entrepreneur took a whole bunch of texts from Project Gutenberg, put them on a CD, and sold them for $2. And my friend somehow got a hold of one of those CD-ROMs, and we put it into the computer, and that changed my life. That CD-ROM is how I, a teenager in Israel before the internet, the public internet, got access to the complete works of Shakespeare, Milton, Lewis Carroll, to translations of Plato, the Victorian era translations by Benjamin Jowett, Aristotle, Confucius, Galen, Voltaire, etc., etc. It was endless, and it was mine. It was in my computer, and I could read it anytime I wanted. Now, some of these texts have been translated into Hebrew. Some of them were available in the university library, not so much in my hometown library, not so much reachable, accessible to teenage Israeli me. So that CD-ROM has made me a free culture activist because I did read the fine print. I did find out where these texts came from and understood that it wasn't the guy who sold my friend a CD for $2. It was a bunch of volunteers who were producing these texts. So I was a happy user, a happy beneficiary of Project Gutenberg for years, first through this CD and then later, of course, online. Fast forward to, Michael Hart died in 2011. I do want to dedicate this to his memory. So fast forward to the story of my digital project, the Project Ben Yehuda. It starts as all good stories start. A long time ago, in a galaxy far away, far, far away, in 1999, which I would like to remind you is before Wikipedia. Some of us are old enough to remember a time before Wikipedia. So yeah, that was before Wikipedia. I made some stone soup. I trust everybody knows the fable of the stone soup, right? The vagrant who rolls into town, is desperately hungry, wants to ask for food, nobody would give him any. He ends up setting up in the town square with an old pot and some water and a big stone in the middle of the pot. And people are curious and ask him, what are you doing? He said, oh, I'm making stone soup. Everybody's curious. How does that work? And he says, well, it's really tasty. You should try it. But it's even better with a carrot, you know. And then someone volunteers to add a carrot, and another person adds an onion, et cetera, et cetera. Delicious soup is had by all. So I made some stone soup in 1999. Actually, I did it again yesterday. You may have participated. If you have, I thank you. You've really helped put this slide together. But also, I hope you've felt you were genuinely creating a valuable thing for our colleagues, especially those who are too shy to ask. So that's how stone soups work. You start with almost nothing, but you invite other people to join you, and amazing things happen. Yay, collaboration. So in 1999, the need I had was not the alphabet soup. The need I had was to quote poetry at work, which is one of my needs. I don't know about you. But I found myself wanting to quote some famous lines by our national poet, a guy named Bialik. And the problem is I don't actually remember them well enough. I mean, I know the ones I mean. I know the lines. I know most of those lines, but I don't want to misquote. And strangely enough, I don't go to work every day carrying my Bialik with me. So the moment when it was apt to quote Bialik at one of my unsuspecting colleagues was gone before I could actually get the text. Of course, that night, I went back to my bookshelf, got the Bialik, copied out the lines, came back triumphantly to work the next day and said, hey, remember that thing with the thing? So these are the lines that are so, and the guy is like, what? Yeah, so the moment was gone. This is a true story. This is the itch that I scratched when I started my digital library. I wanted to be able to quote poetry at work. And I was upset that English speakers have Shakespeare and Milton and Lewis Carroll and everyone at their fingertips to quote at work or read during boring meetings. And I don't. And there's like nothing. There's just nothing in Hebrew online at the time, 1999. So I remembered my old friend, Michael S. Hart, and realized that is why these English texts exist online and are widely mirrored, of course. So I decided to do something about it. And I started my stone soup. That night, the second night, I sat down at my computer and started typing Bialik's poetry into a text file. On the way, I learned that I don't actually know how to add the Hebrew diacritical marks, nikud, which are absolutely essential for poetry in Hebrew. Until that time, I had never had a need to use diacritics in business communication. So I had to teach myself that and a whole bunch of other things. But I did it, and I started typing poems by Bialik. I put the first batch online, and at the bottom I said, hey, so I'm putting up these poems online. If you think it's a good idea and want to help, shoot me an email, and we can divvy up the work or something. That was it. That was the stone in the soup. This is what it looks like today. For the Hebrew challenged among you, I will promise you this is a homepage of a digital library with some notable authors there. My friend Bialik is second from the right there. And I will give you some numbers that I cannot actually see from this angle. Yeah, so we have today, fast forward to 2018, we have published over 11,000 works. Yeah, by 200 authors, thanks to about 1,000 volunteers over the years, with a kind of consistent pool of about 150 to 200 volunteers actively typing or proofreading something right now as we speak. We have about 1 million views per month. It may sound a lot, it may not sound a lot. I remind you there are about 7 million Hebrew speakers on this planet. Oh, sorry, yes. 7 million total speakers and about 5 million kind of native level speakers is the statistic I just looked up. And a little bit of tech, since this is a partially technical audience. Some of you will be happy to hear the technology is Ruby on Rails. We use multi-markdown. It's a dialect of Markdown. Most people know Markdown, maybe you don't know multi-markdown. That's one of the dialects that has something very important to us, which is footnotes. Standard Markdown doesn't have footnotes. A lot of the texts we publish have footnotes. Historical works have hundreds of footnotes. So that was essential for us. So we store the texts internally as multi-markdown, from which we can, of course, generate HTML, PDF, whatever, EPUBs, anything people want. And we're hosted on the Amazon cloud. After the first few years, we were hosted on some university servers in Israel. And the rest of our code is basically homebrewed. We have our own content system, our own transcription system for volunteers, and even our own task management system, which is kind of like an issue tracker, except usable by people with low computer literacy who make up a good chunk of our volunteer base, actually. So I couldn't throw, I don't know, Jira or Bugzilla at those people and say, yeah, let's just manage our work this way. So we wrote our own, nice and simple. We even have the beginnings of a Ferberish catalog, and I'll get to that in just a moment. This is where you go, aw. This is our youngest volunteer actively scanning a book, as you can see. So we scan books and then we deliver those scans over the internet to our volunteers to type and proofread. This young gentleman is about 7 when this photo was taken. He calls me uncle, but yeah, he's our youngest volunteer. So I want to share with you 5 accidents that have happened throughout the 19 years this project has been in existence. And these are things that I think would be interesting to you. The first is what I call accidental authority. So I discovered, that a lot of people will use resources from Project Ben Yehuda, like George Mallory climbing the Everest, because it's there. It's there, it's online, so we use it. That's as far as the calculation goes. Questions of authority, questions of provenance are not high on most users' mental arithmetic. It's there, I found it, Google led me right to it, that's it, I'm using it. If it's not online, if it's paywalled, not making it into my paper. I'm generalizing, it doesn't have to be a paper. And maybe this is more typical of undergrads than of tenured researchers, but by and large, the logic holds. There is a tremendous chilling effect the moment you put any kind of obstacle in front of a resource. Doesn't matter if in the end it's available to me for free. If I have to register, if I have to go through some authorization screen, any kind of interference, and those of you looking at analytics can readily convince yourselves of this by looking at the numbers. Any intermediary you put between people and a resource funnels off some of your potential users. Interestingly, decisions made by volunteers are determining, to some extent, the shape of research, at least the shape of what a lot of literature undergrads will and will not write about. If my volunteers happened to have already gotten to digitizing author X, but not author Y, there's actually a larger chance author X will be studied and written about. Literature professors in Tel Aviv tell me their students look at them funny when they ask them to go to the library. Like physically, like actually, like get up and walk to a building. And you know, the I don't know, the extreme of that range actually responds with indignation. With like, how could you be asking us to do this? Why can't you provide a PDF or, you know, a link? Such are the times. So this is a complete accident to me. I did not set out to affect the shape of research. I just wanted to quote poetry at work, remember? But this is happening. And another aspect of accidental authority is that we, amateurs, none of us is a literature professor or anything of the kind, get asked expert questions all the time. Why? Because we publish the text. We put it online, so obviously we are the people to ask. That logic never made sense to me, but it makes sense to a lot of people. We get the strangest queries from school children asking us to effectively do their homework for them, to tenured professors writing to us as fellow scholars, asking questions about certain texts or first publications or all kinds of things. And we answer all of them as a matter of policy, but we make it clear, you know, what we do and what we don't do and what our credentials aren't. And very often, dare I say it, refer them to the library. But again, I was surprised, I've gotten used to it, but I was surprised by the kinds of questions people refer to me with absolute confidence. And if I were to respond to those questions, you know, substantively without mentioning that I'm just a volunteer, I'm just a guy from the internet, they would have taken my responses as authoritative. Even though in no place do I list myself as any kind of scholar on anything to do with Hebrew literature, just because I'm on the other end of the email address at the bottom of the site. Yeah, and this holds true even though, of course, our work does contain typos and omissions and mistakes despite our best efforts. Of course, being digital, we fix those mistakes as soon as we encounter them, but you know, statistically, the texts have mistakes in them, and what we have found is that for the majority of people, the urgent need not to get up off their chair trumps the risk of some typos. So people use it anyway, even though there's no guarantee the text is in any way authoritative. The second accident I want to share with you is an accidental canon, not this one. Nope, not this one. There we go. The canon. So I lied when I said my classics background had nothing to do with it. Here's some ancient Greek for you. Canon comes from, you know this guy from my big fat Greek wedding? Give me any word, I show you how it comes from Greek. I'm that guy, except more annoying. Because actually canon does come from the Greek kanon, but that in turn comes from Hebrew, from the Hebrew kaneh, which means reed, right? Like the Sea of Reeds. And that is what a canon, a measuring stick, was originally made of, right? A reed that you use to measure. Yeah. So, yes, so the accidental canon. The library we're building strives to be comprehensive, not canonical. We're not a best of. We're not a Giants of Hebrew Literature collection. We are a library, like an academic library, ideally like a national library, like an intergalactic library. We want all the Hebrew texts, all of them, even the really terrible ones, even the horrible Vogon poetry level poetry. And there is a bunch of that. Even the misogynistic ones, even the fascist ones. We want all the texts in Hebrew because we're a library. We're not a gallery of the best of Hebrew literature. However, by the way, and we're maybe 10% of the way, right, to covering everything ever published in Hebrew, maybe. But having published enough of what is considered intuitively by people to be the Hebrew canon, the rest of the canon is assumed. And people clamor for the missing parts of the canon. Now, we publish public domain texts. There are some canonical Hebrew poets from the middle 20th century who did not have the good sense to die on time and are therefore still copyrighted, right? So perhaps the second most well-known Hebrew poet in current Hebrew culture is Natan Alterman, and he died in 1970. So a couple of decades to go before we can, publish his works. Yet people are largely ignorant of copyright, except for Wikipedians. So people don't realize why would Alterman be missing from the site, and they write us polite or angry emails saying, what about Alterman? Isn't he a good enough poet for you? So they just assume, obviously, if you have Bialik, if you have Chernychovsky, if you have other major Hebrew poets, obviously you should have Alterman. And they interpret the presence of non-canon, which is plentiful on the site, including poets nobody's ever heard of, that I personally dug out of oblivion from the 18th century. They interpret that as irrelevant. Like, even though those people are clearly there, they still treat the collection as canonical. Which makes me ask, will all of those non-canonical authors remain non-canon? Or might they have some kind of revival thanks to the dynamic of not getting off my seat, right? I need to study some poet. Here's a poet that nobody studied. I'm going to study him. And as part of my study, I will show that he deserves to be canonical. I can't point to an example of this already happening, but then I don't read all the dissertations in Hebrew literature, so I don't know. It's worth asking anyway. I'm also an accidental publisher. So a lot of literary work is trapped, is scattered and trapped in journals, newspaper, literary supplements, etc. And unless you have been a subscriber of that newspaper in the 30s, you will probably not even know that there are these wonderful translations or essays published. If they were not collected into a book, it's that much harder to even know those things exist. And even when they were digitized in some historical newspaper archive, those archives are generally not included in Google searches unless one makes a special effort, and at least in the Hebrew case, the people who have done some digitization of old newspapers have not made that special effort. And so even a Google search would not make you stumble across those uncollected pieces. So Project Ben Yehuda is the first compiler of previously uncollected works. In some cases, for some authors, we have done the legwork of picking up those individual essays and translations published in literary supplements over the years and are presenting for the first time ever, those works as a body of work under the same page with the collected works of that author. This, of course, makes them more discoverable, which means there's more reuse. And a lot of literary estates, meaning works left behind by authors, unpublished, languish because they're not commercially viable, even if the family, the heirs, want to publish the material. If it's by an author dead for 10, 20 years, usually there's no commercial viability. The Hebrew reading market is small. So they just languish. They just lie there unpublished. Nobody ever read them. A few of those families have contacted us, and Project Ben Yehuda is the first ever publisher of some literary works by published authors, not by random people who have some text they want to express themselves with, but people who have been published by major publishers, but also had some literary estate left unpublished. We are the first publishers of those texts. The fourth accident is literary liberation. I wanted to remind you of my other old friend, Ranganathan, the Indian librarian, who said simply and powerfully, I think, books are for use. Something some people sometimes need reminding of. Books are for use. And copyright law, on the one hand, and market economics on the other, are keeping a huge chunk of literature, especially Hebrew literature, which has a short history. Hebrew began to be used as a secular language for literature only around 1830 to 1850. So think about that. We don't have centuries of novels and poetry. In the case of Hebrew, a vast chunk of our modern literary tradition is in that limbo of way out of print, never be printed again, but also copyrighted. Which makes for a disjointed literary tradition, which makes for our young authors, and this is something that literary critics are complaining about for years in the Hebrew literary world, our younger authors are disconnected from the literary tradition because they literally don't know about these books published 30 or 40 years ago because they're out of print and not accessible, and not all of them do the archival research. Which makes for a kind of myopia between the literary tradition that is available, largely thanks to Project Ben Yehuda these days, going up to the 1930s, 1940s, and the present day, things that are within living memory for literary people in Israel. So we secure permission from the copyright holders, from families, children, grandchildren of those authors, and publish those texts before the copyright expires, thereby liberating that literature from the chokehold that does nobody any good of copyright on the one hand and commercial non-viability on the other. And finally, I found myself an accidental librarian. Some more quotes by our friend Ranganathan. A library needs a catalog. I run a digital library, so I need a catalog. But because our library is born digital, I get to do it a different way. First of all, I'm not weighed down by legacy. I don't have millions of MARC records. And we catalog works, not volumes. Works. That means a 4-line poem is a catalog entity in our catalog. And a 4-volume novel is also a single entity in my catalog. Every work, every poem, every article, every short story is its own entity, first-class citizen in our Ferberish catalog. That, in turn, opens a vast universe of possibilities. We can now discuss the fact that this article, one of 300 articles in this book, is a book review about this other text, which we also have in our repository. We can start mapping these semantically rich relationships between works in our corpus. We have Hebrew authors writing about other Hebrew authors all the time. either about individual works or kind of an essay about the entire oeuvre of a certain author. And our catalog can now express those relationships for the benefit of the reader. So these were 5 accidents that happened to me. Now you know how to watch out so it doesn't happen to you. A few words about our citizenship in the wider open movement. There's already a lot of reuse happening of Project Ben Yehuda materials, especially through Wikipedia, because the moment Wikipedia links from the article about an author to the page with all the works of that author on Project Ben Yehuda, that of course drives traffic and drives people to use, to encounter these words. I didn't mention this, but of course our site is free and without advertisement. I should have mentioned it. Simple public access is the key. The fact that when you are linked to Project Ben Yehuda, or when you search for something on Google and you land in Project Ben Yehuda, you're just there. The text is right in front of you. There are no pop-ups begging you to register. There's no login screen. There are no ads. Nothing is flashing. You just get to the text. And that drives use. Wikidata, which I taught a workshop on the first day, and is our structured and linked data project, is a natural venue for interoperability and discovery. The moment Wikidata also knows that the full text works of a certain author are available on Project Ben Yehuda, that allows machine discovery of those resources, so that a librarian in Brazil could serve their Hebrew-speaking readers, if they show up, by finding them Hebrew texts without speaking a word of Hebrew themselves. Of course, we offer free and DRM-free books, meaning unencumbered by any kind of copy protection. And we also participate in the open movement by sharing our entire corpus in a dump, in a bulk download for various uses, including computational linguistics, machine learning, even computer poetry. There's a semi-famous Israeli poet and computer programmer who has been using our corpus to train his computer poetry generating programs by feeding them a whole lot of Hebrew poetry. Looking ahead for Project Ben Yehuda, I want to share with you one piece of our vision. You may have heard about massively multiplayer online role-playing games. I say, forget about that. Let's do massively multiplayer online bibliography. By which I mean a crowdsourced, with oversight and provenance, a crowdsourced bibliographic works. The first project is the table of contents of everything. So scholarly publications, which a lot of you deal with, are exceptionally well documented and handled these days, right? There's all these databases and repositories and protocols for harvesting and sharing and discovering. What about non-academic essays? What about T.S. Eliot's essays? What about travel writing? There's no good massive scale cataloging of those nonfiction works and what they are about. So a first project I would like to launch, remember this is the looking ahead, this stuff doesn't exist yet. I just have a cool name for it. The first project I'm interested in launching is a crowdsourced effort to simply create, transcribe, type, or proofread OCR tables of contents of all the books, all the materials that are essentially not already covered by the professionals. For example, nonfiction essays. The second project, which we'll be building on that, is the Aboutness project, in which I will want to take each one of those entities that I will have created in the table of contents of everything and document what they are about by, again, inviting the public to tell me what they are about. Details TBD, but basically we can offer the public to like a gamified interface to classify it by Library of Congress subject headings, by Wikidata entities, by any vocabulary that would make sense, other vocabularies in other languages. And thanks to the fact that a lot of these vocabularies are harmonized, it's okay if someone classifies by the French Rameau, is it called? You know, because we know how to map Rameau subjects to LCSH subjects, for example. So I envision a planet-wide effort to document what everything is about. And of course, this would feed back to Wikidata, which would make all of those resources even more discoverable, so that people who would never reach for a volume called Francis Bacon's Collected Essays, because who knows what's in there, will actually be able to discover the fact that Bacon wrote an article precisely about their research interest, which they would never find in a current library catalog. So, what other civilian open repositories have you not heard of? Is a question I'd like you to ponder. I haven't heard of them either. But I submit to you that similar work to this work that I've presented to you is happening all over the world, generally outside your organizations, generally outside the academy, outside companies, outside national grants. And you need to find them, talk to them, see how you can work together. Speaking of missing knowledge, I would like to suggest to you 3 assertions. So I warn you, right? You had 5 accidents, now you have 3 assertions, so you know more or less how long we have left. So my first assertion, which should not be controversial, is that the open movement has arrived. And I believe I saw a tweet earlier that made the same point. I apologize for the repetition. The open movement, in the broadest sense, free software, free culture, free knowledge, free data, has arrived. It is mainstream now. It is broadly acknowledged to be the way forward. Conservative players like governments and universities are embracing it. Business models exist around all of these things so that there can be commercial players, commercial activities supporting these movements in a healthy way. These principles of open and unconditional access have triumphed over the traditional principles of control and need to know. And that's a good thing, because that's the kind of thing that brought that CD-ROM to me when I was a teenager. Free software is running most of the web, most of your devices. Free culture is present in every reading device you have. Most reading apps will offer you Project Gutenberg titles. Free knowledge, of course, from Wikipedia and elsewhere, tops search results and is consumed by more than 1 billion people every month. And free data informs news coverage, data journalism, and decision-making. My second assertion is that the open movement and traditional memory institutions are natural partners. To make this point, I will now channel my friend and fellow Wikimedian, Liam Wyatt. Liam Wyatt says, "We do the same things for the same reasons, serving the same public. We do have a different approach, different context, and different skills." Liam also says, "Do you have volunteers at your organization?" I guess many of you do. How about e-volunteers? No? Well, you do. You just don't have a relationship with them yet. Wikipedians and other free culture and free knowledge activists are your e-volunteers. You just need to create a relationship with them. So that was my channeling of Liam. I will briefly describe, for those who have not really heard or seen Wikimedia and cultural institution partnerships happen, some of the classic elements of a partnership. Of course, not all of them exist in every partnership, but basically it starts with education, educating the staff and or the patrons or management of the cultural institution about how Wikipedia works, how Wikimedia Commons works, that's our multimedia repository where all the photos and videos are kept, how Wikidata works, projects to harmonize metadata between the institution's own collections and vocabularies and Wikidata. Again, this is something most people don't know how to do, but is eminently doable. And if you are interested in doing this, contact me. I'll put you in touch with volunteers local to your location or as close to that as possible. And you can do it today or tomorrow. You can do it soon and make sure your resources are discoverable through Wikidata. Exposure of your institutional resources via featuring them or linking to them from Wikipedia articles. Again, Wikipedia articles are the front window, are that thing that tops Google results. You know, companies pay, I don't know how many thousands of dollars to slightly improve, right, SEO and all that, slightly improve their rankings. Wikipedia is already there. If your resources are findable via a relevant Wikipedia article, you will have gotten that much more exposure. And you won't have to pay anyone anything for it. Partnerships also sometimes contain an element of content donation, where the institution donates some of its objects, digital representations of its objects, to the Wikimedia Commons. This is a technical detail, maybe not all of you know. Wikipedia will not display objects, even with IIIF, from a remote source for security reasons. Basically because it's too easy to change an external resource and replace it with an image of a penis, as people do. So Wikipedia will only include photos from our multimedia repository, from the Wikimedia Commons. That's why it's important to donate copies of your objects, even if you already have your state-of-the-art IIIF server. We cannot use it. So we are very grateful for content donations, which of course also have to be done with appropriate deference to metadata, to mapping your metadata to our metadata, usually a fairly simple task of a single afternoon and a script writing person. We do events at the institutions that host us. These can be training workshops or what we call editathons, where experienced editors show up to just hack away at the keyboard and edit, where the institution provides the materials, the sources, enabling experienced Wikipedians to make a lot of progress with resources they usually don't have access to. And digitization or transcription projects are also sometimes part of the partnership between Wikimedia and memory institutions. And finally, online contribution campaigns, such as writing contests or social media campaigns to improve the coverage or the contents on the wiki projects related to your institution's holdings or interests. Some of those online activities have been very successful in getting content written in 15 or 20 different languages, which often your institution would not have a practical other way of generating, you know, coverage in Turkish and Arabic and Armenian. And there are elements of the partnership we have not discovered yet. The sky's the limit when you put your mind to it in terms of what we might do together. So I'll give you some examples in brief. The Wikimedian in Residence model, which was invented by my friend Liam Wyatt. He basically created that job description for himself and walked into the British Museum and said, "Hi, I would like to be your Wikimedian in Residence." And long story short, he was. So there's been work with the British Museum, with the British Library. You may have heard about the British Library's massive release of maps from their collection. So, there were a whole bunch of high-quality scanned maps, but not a lot of good metadata and not a lot of good linking of those maps to the places that they describe. Wikimedia volunteers have made those links to where exactly those maps, what exactly they cover, including, I don't know the technical term for it, but putting the modern map over the historical map and kind of synchronizing them, scaling and warping and doing what it takes so that you can actually see the modern map versus the old map. This is work the British Library would have had a hard time achieving on its own, and a lot of our enthusiastic mapping volunteers have helped do. We've done work with the US National Archive. In fact, the US National Archive has had a Wikipedian in residence for, I think, 6 years now, full time. The Smithsonian, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that also gave a very generous content donation to Wikipedia and the Wikimedia Commons and to Wikidata, where a lot of the Met's excellent metadata has informed and enriched the description of objects and places in Wikidata. Oxford University, the University of Edinburgh, the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, the German Federal Photo Archive. I'm just listing these names to give you an idea of the kind and caliber of institutions that have chosen to work with Wikimedia. I won't describe each and every one of these projects. The Nobel Foundation, the Versailles Palace, the Carpathian Ethnography Project. So that's a or quad country project to document culture and folklore in the Carpathians. It's a fieldwork project, and Wikimedians were involved with professional ethnographers in documenting and capturing and describing the interesting new knowledge about Carpathian folklore. The Bulgarian State Archives, the Museum of Romanticism in Madrid, which digitized a lot of music, a lot of recorded performances that museum had. So those are now available for the public on Commons. And it's not only in Europe and the US. As was mentioned, I have an interest in emerging communities in the rest of the world. So we've worked with museums in Mexico, the University of Sao Paulo Museum of Veterinary Anatomy, an undercovered topic on Wikipedia, but thanks to that university, we now have good coverage of veterinary anatomy, not the kind of thing that most of our volunteers are able to supply on their own. We've done digitization projects in Chile, worked with the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, the Novosti Archive in Russia, which gave us a lot of audio samples of notable people, including non-Russian people who were interviewed on Russian radio. And sometimes it's the only available freely accessed voice sample of those people. And another interesting project from a small medical college in southern India, we got a very wonderful collection of pathology images, right? Liver with this disease, liver with that disease. Again, not something our volunteers can easily procure otherwise, but a Wikipedian who happened to be studying medicine at that university simply made that happen by talking to her professors. So there's plenty more examples and amazing photos to come with them in this link. The slides will be made available right after this. And finally, for those who have not attended my workshop on Monday, I will repeat the message. Wikidata is love. It is our new, shiny, structured, and linked data project. For those of you who have done any work with linked data, with triples and statements and RDF and that kind of thing, it's basically that, but on a wiki and editable by all. If that sounds crazy to you, I will remind you that is how Wikipedia works. So yes, it is crazy, but it does work. It is fantastically multilingual. If you look at Wikidata at a fairly kind of well-known topic like Barack Obama or Nelson Mandela or Lionel Messi, you will see we have labels, names for these people in 150, 200 languages. You can experience Wikidata, you can browse Wikidata in your own language with surprisingly high quality coverage. And it is a natural connection point or nexus for aligning vocabularies. any vocabulary, any stable ID you want to harmonize with anything else, you can do via Wikidata, and you'd be welcome. We don't impose our ontology on you. And a lot of, again, if you look at a central topic on Wikidata, you will find, for example, 200 or 300 external IDs, right? Like same as relationships, right? 200 IDs, like the Library of Congress and VIAF and IMDb and MusicBrainz and the Czech National Monuments Database and anything you care to think of. Yes, indeed. And that makes it a natural source for discovery. Indeed, you can use Wikidata to leapfrog from one database to another. If you have a VF ID for some John Smith and you want to get to the Library of Congress record for it, or the IMDb record indeed, and you want to make sure you reach the right John Smith, Wikidata's got you covered. You can look for that ID in Wikidata and then look for the other ID in the Wikidata record. And even without caring about anything else in the Wikidata item, you will have used Wikidata to discover other external resources. It is also a powerful resource for enrichment of your holdings. Wikidata can often provide easy to machine generate little annotations or enriched details for things that may not be the focus of your collection and therefore not very well described in your collection, but you can still, I don't know, if it's, for example, a place of birth of a person in your collection, but you don't have particular expertise about geography and toponyms, etc., Wikidata's got you covered and can help you resolve that toponym and show all the relevant information about that, for example. And it is about to become, later this year, a powerful digital object management platform. I don't know if many of you realize that. We have a project called Structured Data on Commons, which will transform our veteran existing multimedia library commons into one that is based on structured and linked data like Wikidata, so that you will be able to, for example, query the entire library of 46 million freely licensed files for anything that depicts sowing seeds, for example. You'll be able to query for that, or for anything that depicts raising children coupled with, I don't know, location Germany. That kind of search. Again, the arbitrarily complicated searches that linked data and Sparkle allow you to do, you will be able to do on our 46 million file media library later this year. So I encourage you to learn Wikidata today before it becomes mainstream, so that you can be a Wikidata hipster and say, oh yeah, Wikidata, I knew it before it was cool. So remember, we are talking about 3 assertions. My third assertion is that there are huge gaps in what we have in the wiki projects. There are huge geographical gaps, gender gaps, access gaps, and cultural gaps. This map shows participation in Wikimedia projects by country. The darker, the more participation per capita or per 10,000 people we have. So the map is not very surprising, I guess. We have a lot of participation in Western Europe, in North America, less in South America, next to nothing in Africa. So this map is not very surprising, but it is a participation gap, right? We have far too few people participating from Nigeria. We have far too few people participating from Kazakhstan and from Vietnam. This somewhat similar map is completely different, actually. This is a map of the coverage of topics. So every dot in this map is an item in Wikidata that has coordinates. So we put it on a map. Any item of any kind, right? A building, a monument, whatever. Again, you can see Western Europe is extraordinarily well covered, and North America, the rest of the world, very, very sparse. The first map was colored by the entire country, right? This one is more precise because it's the actual coordinates. So you can see even within a country, the huge, huge gaps. Wikidata, for example, is aware of only about 3 hospitals in the entire country of Ghana. There are more than 3 hospitals in Ghana, but Wikidata doesn't know that. The percentage of editors of Wikipedia that explicitly identify as female, so we have a gender field, it is optional, so optional that we don't even include it in our sign-up procedure. Like, you have to actually go to the preferences to set it, which is why the vast majority of users never set it. But of those who do, only between 9 and 17% identify as female. Now, this is likely underrepresentative because there's no doubt there's a quantity of women who choose not to identify as female or even to explicitly identify as male because of harassment, which is a very sad and unfortunate fact on the projects as on the wider internet. So we can assume that there are in fact a little more than that, but definitely nowhere near 50-50. And again, that was about the participation gender gap. This is about the content gap. The percentage of women among the people described on our projects is about 18%, right? So the articles about women, which of course don't have to be written by women, right, are about 18%. It is not unreasonable to think that greater participation by women in the projects will also involve greater coverage of women, although again, there's no necessary connection. So we consider these gaps a knowledge equity challenge. That's the term we use in the Wikimedia movement as of last year, knowledge equity. And it has become, just earlier this year, one of our 2 strategic goals for the next 12 years. One of the 2 things we're going to focus on very strongly in ways that are TBD, but the Wikimedia movement has committed to do something. We don't quite know what that something is yet about these knowledge equity issues. And again, it's not just these gender and geography gaps, it's also the access to the internet gap, etc. But these are actually things we are less well positioned to do much about. So we've been doing something about these gaps already. We've done a bunch of research, which is how we came up with these numbers. We have been doing themed editathons. Some of you may have heard of them. A lot of writing drives and competitions and campaigns to write about notable women, to write women back into history, to narrow the gender gap, et cetera, et cetera. We've had themed contests to add content about Africa. All of these were successful. All of these, moved the needle somewhat, but there's a long way to go. And we need to do a lot more with the heavier lifting, including culture change. We have a culture problem in Wikipedia that perpetuates some of this systemic bias. For example, an editor on Wikipedia may delete an article because it relies on a source like the Lagos Times from Nigeria, just because that editor has never heard of the Lagos Times and doesn't realize that is a perfectly valid newspaper to rely on, even if it's not the New York Times. That kind of behavior is an additional hurdle that is encountered by people trying to cover, for example, African topics on Wikipedia. And undoing that is a lot harder than doing a writing competition and generating a few hundred articles. There's the challenge of oral knowledge. So, the Wikimedia vision is to create a world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. A very ambitious vision. That's a good thing for a vision. But the sum of all knowledge is not in academic writing, right? The sum of all knowledge includes a whole lot of knowledge that isn't and never will be in academic sources. Some of that knowledge is also not written, oral knowledge. And that's a huge challenge for our projects. How does an encyclopedia reflect oral knowledge? How do we cite oral knowledge? These are questions that have potential answers. We need to do the thinking, and like I said, we need a culture change. We need to convince our community, not all of which sees what we see, what I'm telling you right now. We need to convince them that yes, oral knowledge does matter. It's not all tribal knowledge or indigenous knowledge. Some of it is perfectly important historical knowledge, geographical knowledge, not scientific knowledge perhaps, but knowledge about things science also is interested in, like the medicinal properties of plants, for example. And we need to find a way to include more of that knowledge on the projects. That is a formidable challenge facing the Wikimedia movement. Formidable especially because it's not actually a technical challenge. There's no amount of investment in software that we can do to solve it. And we need to combat harassment. Harassment is a huge issue on the internet, as you well know. It is also an issue on our projects, even though we have a civility policy and we have tools like blocking and identifying what we call sock puppets, people trying to impersonate other accounts. We need better tools, and we need stronger culture to put a stop to the harassment that some people do still encounter, including our opening keynote speaker, on the Wikimedia projects. Again, this is something we have newly recommitted to this year for our upcoming strategy. So I want to end by sharing with you a few specific challenges that the Wikimedia movement and the free culture movement in general encounters trying to partner with memory institutions in emerging communities. First, budget. You know this one. I don't need to say a lot about it. It's generally an obstacle for most institutions, including over here in North America, in Western Europe. Everybody's complaining about the budget. But the scale is different in some emerging communities. When I say emerging communities, I'm referring to our emerging communities, places where the Wikimedia and the free knowledge community is still emerging, that largely overlaps to what was known as the Global South or the developing world, but also includes some places that are not considered Global South, like, for example, Portugal is an emerging community in terms of its free knowledge production. So in emerging communities, budgetary problems can be so severe they do not allow even that little leeway to experiment, to try something new, to do anything beyond the routine. On the other hand, on occasion, actually the lack of budget could drive collaboration. For example, in a certain African country, the National Heritage Authority or something, the government body responsible for monuments and heritage, confided in us, in Wikimedia volunteers, that they are so cash-strapped, they have not visited a lot of the monuments that they are in charge of for over a decade. So they literally have no idea what physical shape these monuments are in, if they need repairs, if anything about what's going on there. It's a big country, and they literally cannot afford to do the kind of mapping, the oversight that they are supposedly in charge of, which made them very happy, indeed eager, to partner with our volunteers in a photography competition we had there called Wiki Loves Monuments, where we went and photographed every single one of those monuments for us, for Commons, you know, to be able to illustrate Wikipedia articles with it, but it was also a huge service to that heritage authority because it literally gave them fresh photos of those monuments and helped them, you know, prioritize maintenance, etc. More poignant, I think, is the tech literacy issue. Again, not a unique issue to emerging communities, but more strongly felt there among staff of institutions, among management of institutions. There are still, and I have met some people like that, who are directors or general managers of cultural institutions or government ministries in charge of cultural institutions who are completely computer illiterate, who do not have a computer on their desk, and they have people for handling that, but they themselves, the decision makers, the people whom the other people are looking to for approval to do something, they themselves are so far out of the reach of modern computer digital culture, it's very hard to get that nod, to get that approval from the person in charge. But also the availability of tech skills among staff, that script person, right? That person who needs to do the 10-line Ruby or Python program to munge the data from this into that, or to use OpenRefine or whatever. Those people are just not there in many institutions. And when they're not there, it's as good as impossible to move forward. Sometimes our own volunteers can supply that tech literacy. It's not always enough because they're not part of the bureaucracy, they're not part of the organization. And sometimes our own volunteers lack the tech skills in emerging communities. This is something that you would not encounter for the most part out here in North America, in Europe. There's plenty of experienced Wikipedians who are also software engineers or hackers or free software people, or even if they're not, it's easy to round up someone from the local Python club and get their help. It's a lot harder in other parts of the world. There are just fewer programmers, fewer people with the confidence and skills to handle complex metadata. The third challenge is what I like to call Smog, the dragon from The Hobbit. And these are the kinds of librarians or collection owners who believe their job is to lie on the pile of gold and defend it from use. These are the mortal enemies of Ranganathan and me. They believe their job is to prevent access and to preserve, right, just to preserve, to keep the gold safe, the books safe from use. These people, again, are, I hope I can say, a dying breed in most of the world, but you still encounter them a lot in places like India. This is a particularly sore point for me because when I was a kid in a small town in Israel, I pretty much finished the children's library at some point when I was, 10, and there was one librarian there who would not let me even enter the grown-up library to forage for new books. And happily, the other librarian did let me, so I had to coordinate my visits with the other librarian's schedule. But I have never forgiven that first librarian. This also reminds me of Mordak, the preventer of information services from Dilbert. He seems to share that ethic that in an ideal world, nobody would access anything. Yeah, so those people are still around. Then there's the conservatives, the people who are concerned about, is anyone else doing this crazy thing you're offering here? Is anyone else talking to you, weird people from the internet? To which the answer is, of course, yes, as I've shown you in the previous slides. But very often people want a local example, right? Is the library next door, is the other university doing this yet? Even when you show them that, yes, Harvard, British Museum, the National Archive have all worked with us, they want to know if the other university in the next town is doing it or not, or if the minister in this country has approved it or not. And again, this is a pattern we've observed. I'm making generalizations, obviously, but it is based on our aggregate experience. I have observed in emerging communities a much greater reluctance to take initiative, to dare at anything but the top level executive. Everybody's looking upwards for the nod. And even, department managers, collection managers, branch managers, any kind of mid-level, even senior mid-level management usually does not dare take the plunge. They're all looking at the executive director. Sometimes the executive director is not enough because they're looking at the minister or the CEO of the national authority or whatever. There's frequently just zero room for individual initiative. And that has been our entry point in other countries, right? It's often been that one curator who got it, that one librarian who was with it and tried something and did something, and then we were able to show management, hey, look at this thing we did. That chance to start small, to pilot, to co-conspire with someone at the staff level is often denied us in emerging communities. And finally, and most painfully, corruption. This is something that breaks my heart every time anew when our volunteers in emerging communities manage to negotiate some kind of partnership, some agreement, the all-important MOU without which nothing happens in certain parts of the world. They do that. For example, in a country I will not name in Western Africa, there's been an agreement with the head of the National Archive that Wikimedia volunteers will get to digitize materials from the National Archive. There was a signed MOU, no charge, everything's great. The volunteers show up at the National Archive, and the staff at the archive refuses to cooperate, despite the MOU. When the volunteers start negotiating what's going on, what do we need to do, they're told, oh yeah, but the photocopier is broken, so you cannot photocopy anything. So they come back the next week, the photocopier is still broken. The photocopier is broken to this day. And it later emerges that the photocopier isn't really broken, it's just that by claiming the photocopier is broken, the archive staff gets to say, well, you can walk over, to the equivalent of a Kinko and photocopy it there, but of course we can't give you archival material to do this, so we would have to do it for you, for which of course they would like a small gratuity. So it emerged that in fact the staff was determined to make a buck using this scheme. For every piece of paper, for every document they wanted to digitize, which of course renders the project impossible for us to move forward with. We tried escalating this to the director of the National Archive, promised to look into it, and nothing happened. Later, inside sources told us the reason is the director professionally depends on that person who was running that racket. Right? The director is new and doesn't know enough about the actual arrangement of the archive, and this person knows where everything is, and so they cannot afford to open a conflict with that staff person. So that was the end of our attempt to work with that National Archive, and we don't see a way forward until those people change. Another example is those monuments that we go around and take photos of in a different African country. We got an MOU again with the head of the Heritage Authority that allows us to go into all the monument sites, including ones that are not generally open to the public, armed with the MOU, and take photos, and also free of charge in sites that charge an entrance fee. That's all written in the MOU. Our volunteers happily travel to all corners of the country, show up with the MOU. The local person, person at the gate, refuses to honor the MOU and says, nope, you need to pay, because it turns out they kind of pocket half that pay. So they had no interest in granting free entrance, and nothing helped. There was no way to call the central authority, etc., and the trip was wasted because they insisted on charging them money. So people have these little fiefdoms, and they are able to just ignore even the good intentions of the top management, even when we are able to convince them. The final example I will give you is that an archaeology department, also in Africa, and African archaeology is a woefully undercovered topic, not just in Wikipedia, but on the internet in general. even if you just look at the articles about archaeology, like the topic in general, or stratigraphy, or topics in archaeology, you will find all the examples are from European stratigraphy, European Iron Age concepts, and they're just different in Africa, and most of our content doesn't acknowledge that. So an archaeology department in Africa was happy to work with us, believes in our vision, wants African archaeology to be better represented on the web, gets it. And at the end of the very good meeting we had, they said, but we need to run it by the university's PR department. And the university's PR department is terrified of commercial exploitation. They don't know to explain what kind of commercial exploitation they're particularly worried about in publishing some archaeological finds, but they're terrified of it. And they're terrified of being blamed for it. Nobody wants to take the responsibility for having given the go-ahead. Great reluctance on all sides to own it, right? So that the archaeology professor wouldn't own the risk and say, no, I'm giving you permission, go ahead and do it, because they're terrified of the PR department or the rector or whatever. The PR department finds it easier to say no, of course, than to take a risk and say yes, and that's where things stop. All right, that sounds tough. What does work? So some things that do work in our experience are showing people case studies, literally walking them through. Here's what we did with the Versailles Palace. Here's what the palace got out of it. To give you a super quick example, the German Photo Archive, the German Federal Photo Archive, donated 100,000 priceless historical photos to Wikimedia more than 10 years ago. They felt they were basically doing Wikipedia a favor. They didn't expect to get any benefit out of it themselves. To their surprise, not only did traffic to their own website grow 200% just from people clicking through on images on Wikipedia, finding that the statement that says, this image comes from the German Federal Photo Archive, and then clicking further to actually see, oh, the German Federal Photo Archive, that's interesting. What other stuff do they have? Just those people, which is, of course, is a fraction of the people who visit the page, just that was enough to double their traffic, which is something they were happy to show their managers in terms of investing in their web presence. And the second surprising thing is that they began to receive a steady stream of metadata corrections. Oh yeah, Wikipedians are detail obsessed. And they started going through those historical photos and saying, nope, that's not 1981, that's 1918, there's a typo here. Or nope, that cannot be Köln because Köln was bombed on this year, so it has to be Mainz, or this is not this church, it's that church. Correcting photograph metadata. Now, if you ask the Federal Photo Archive, do you have mistakes in your metadata? They'll say, well, of course we do. And if you ask them, well, why don't you fix them? They'll tell you, well, it's never a good day to, drop everything and fix 50 million records of metadata, right? But what if you get a stream of highly informed and usually correct corrections from people who sometimes include footnotes in their corrections? Well, that's priceless. And they got such a steady stream, they literally had to hire a temp, a student part-time, just to kind of triage and handle those corrections. So that's just a brief example of a case study that when you say that to people, if they do care about the quality of their metadata, they may find that appealing. So that kind of thing does work. And testimonials from you through professional networks that we volunteers don't have access to, that can work too. If you're able to do a pilot, a small pilot, an off-mainstream pilot, that is often better than all the talk in the world. For example, in India, where we had the hardest time creating even a single GLAM partnership, there was a beautiful partnership in Kolkata, in West Bengal, with an eccentric person who runs something called the Kolkata Little Magazine Library and Research Center. It's basically a shop. I don't know what this guy sells, but the shop is also a magazine library and research center. So his personal obsession, passion, is collecting historical magazines from Bengal's rich history going back to colonial times, magazines in English and Bengali, amazing treasure troves of information on culture, on literature, on politics, on colonialism. And he has copies. He does not have a way of digitizing them. He's not a librarian. He's not an archivist. He's a passionate amateur. He met our passionate amateurs from Wikipedia. They helped him digitize some of those magazines, transcribed them in English and Bengali, and made them available on Wikisource, where now they can re-enter the digital bloodstream and people can start finding them, stumbling onto them, citing them, etc. This is just a partnership between two passionate partners outside any academic or librarian circle. But with that, we can show these results. We can talk to libraries and show them the benefit of the work. If we invest in community building, as we do, we invest in our own volunteer communities, in training them the skills, so that our volunteer can come to an institution and know about metadata, about XML, about OpenRefine, about scripting, about the alphabet soup that all y'all use. That is something we need to invest in so that to make those partnerships more likely. And we are spending some time in training our volunteers who are, random people from the internet, on how to talk to partners, how to talk to people in suits. I'm glad most of you are not. But how to talk to grown-ups, how to talk to people who are professionals in their field, how to use their vocabulary, how to speak our message in ways that will be heard. And finally, partnering outside your own field. One thing we've found very useful is to engage free software hackers who are not interested in editing the encyclopedia, but who are interested in programming against a cool API. You talk to them about the Wikipedia API, the Wikidata API, the challenge of munging metadata from here to there, consuming a JSON service, and they might be willing to help you with absolutely no interest in what Wikipedia does with it later. And those communities are easier to find than free culture communities. There's more free software communities around the world. So we've had some success engaging free software people around the world, and this applies to you as well, of course. For those of you who don't have a very developed technical department or who have an understaffed technical department, there are free software hackers out there who may be excited to work on your challenges. They just don't know about them. They don't know about Samvera. They don't know about the tools we use. They don't know that we use open source code and APIs. The shift to open technologies in this space has been really breathtaking, I think, in the last 10 years. But a lot of free software hackers who don't happen to have a volunteer interest in libraries don't know about it. Not banging endlessly against walls, we have found helps. So we're done with that African National Archive. They'll come around sooner or later. We're focusing on other opportunities. So don't obsess on getting that one thing you wanted to get. Work with whoever is willing. And we can build on the precedent of success. Take the local success, make it international, take a modest success, translate it into a more ambitious project. In conclusion, I want to share with you the thought that a lot depends still on individual initiative and volunteerism. And these volunteers are there. You need to find them and cultivate them. Again, what Liam said, create a relationship with your e-volunteers. They're out there and waiting to work with you. And I also want to remind you that authority happens whether we like it or not. And all your fine IRs and protocols and preservation for the ages are great for people like me who know and understand these technologies and who rely on them long term. I mean, who but me knows what an amateur I am? But for the vast majority of the public, my site is far more visible, far more useful, and even undeservedly gets a halo of authority. Some of this will get easier with time. Generational changes, people move on, people born into technology take their place, and public demand is gradually creating pressure on governments, on local authorities to make things available. From data to laws. There are countries out there where the law of the land, is not actually available to the citizens, right? Only lawyers who buy expensive CD-ROMs or subscription services have access to the law. How crazy is that? People in 7th century BC Athens, see, I'm doing it again, have had a revolution demanding that the laws be written down. There are countries today with less access to the law than ancient Athenians. I also want to suggest to you that these days with cloud computing, etc., and containers and Dockers and all that, tech affluent organizations, I say tech affluent, it doesn't have to be really money affluent, but basically the organizations you're all affiliated with are tech affluent, can do a lot more for your colleagues in emerging communities. It is super easy, if you're already on the cloud, if you already have those resources, to spin up another instance for another institution in the developing world to play with, to learn, to experiment. Even if for a whole variety of legal and bureaucratic reasons, you won't actually be able to host their actual IR or whatever in the long term, maybe you can just offer them this training ground, this opportunity to learn, to understand the benefits, to help explain it to their management. Maybe you don't need to tell your management you're doing it. My point is, it's super easy to do. I think more of that needs to happen. And finally, my truly final thought, consider interacting with Wikidata in everything you do. Pretty much everything you do has some potential contact point with Wikidata. If you're not sure how to find that, talk to me. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for inviting me. And thank you for helping me make stone soup.
So thank you so much for that. That was really great. We are actually scheduled to be done now, but we still need a few more minutes of your time, and I think that you probably do have some questions. So if you do need to leave, please feel free to do so, but otherwise, I think we'll open up the floor to a couple of questions.
That was really interesting, thank you. Whenever I've tried to engage with the community to get a response back from just people out there, I've always struggled. And one of the reasons I think that is because on organizations like Wikimedia, people are, and correct me if I'm wrong, editing things that they care about personally. Whereas when we have our open community here, very often people care professionally, and so there's, I think, a much greater limit of what they're willing to give, particularly in their own time. Is there any way around that? Like how can we get out there to get people to be more giving to the community when it's more of a professional capacity they're operating in rather than kind of something they personally care about?
Thank you, that's a good question. First of all, the standard way of interacting with Wikipedians on Wikipedia is by editing what we call talk pages, right? Behind every article there's a talk page, and that's where our kind of binding conversations happen. However, and that takes a little getting used to and a little learning, and maybe that itself is putting a lot of people off from interacting with Wikipedians, which of course is a shame. So one thing that does exist these days is a whole bunch of alternative channels and networks that are around Wikipedia. So you won't be able, for example, to undelete an article or change policy on Wikipedia by talking on Facebook. But you will be able to get help, to get advice, to just talk, to discuss a potential partnership, absolutely, on Facebook, on mailing lists, and there's a whole bunch of resources. There's a specific mailing list for Wikipedia and libraries, which has a lot of librarians on it and a lot of Wikipedians who understand libraries on it. So that's a perfect venue, for example, to discuss this sort of thing. There's a more general GLAM mailing list. There are Facebook groups for GLAM. There are Facebook groups for Wikipedia, where, again, it's a much more casual way of interacting that will be easier for people. But to take the other side of your question about how to get people from your professional circles to engage more with Wikipedia, I want to share the message. Wikipedia, there are like 101 ways to help Wikimedia beside writing an article like the causes of World War II from start to finish. That's one kind of thing we do on Wikipedia, and that's what most people imagine when they think about editing Wikipedia. But you can help by fixing typos, you can help by adding references, which is what most of you are amply able to do because you live in a library. I know, you actually go home sometimes. Classifying photography, harmonizing metadata. There's a whole bunch of things you can do that don't require you to learn all the policies of Wikipedia or to edit, to write articles from start to finish. I think a lot of professionals don't know that. They feel, yeah, contributing to Wikipedia, that means writing articles. I'm not interested in that. That's okay. You know, writing encyclopedic articles is a weird hobby. I say this with love. I'm weird, but not everybody has to be weird. So again, I think the beginning of a conversation is to socialize the idea that there's a whole bunch of ways to work with this community. Many of them right up the alley of professionals like you.
Thank you for the talk. I really appreciate Wikipedia. I use it all the time. It was interesting to learn about your related projects. I'm wondering, I'm thinking about you're wanting to be more inclusive and include more articles about women and people from, underrepresented areas. And I'm wondering if there's any relation between Wikipedia insisting on using only secondary sources for articles about people who are barely represented in secondary sources to begin with as being a compounding factor for that occurrence.
Absolutely. That is a huge factor in the underrepresentation of women, of topics about Africa, about Laos. I mean, secondary literature, as we understand it in the West, has taken an interest in certain things and not in others. Women classical music composers have been demonstrably and systematically written out of history so that we now need alternative references to unearth women composers that did demonstrably exist. And some of the conservative Wikipedians will reject them because they don't appear in the whatever big book of classical composers. So yes, there's a huge sourcing issue and documentation challenge. And I think the feminist movement has actually shown us the way decades ago. Part of the feminist project in the 50s, the 60s was setting up these documentation centers to start collecting the stuff that was written out of history. And some of these projects are now perfectly respectable sources and make up the bedrock of research today. We need a lot more of that kind of work. So it's not all about picking the right source. Sometimes it's actually about generating some sources. And again, people from the library and repository world can really help in some kind of voluntary, expert-led, but public participatory project for the documentation, for tagging, for annotation. These are all things that indirectly will feed into Wikipedia by becoming citable sources.
I think we have time for one more question.
I'll stick around if anyone else wants to ask questions.
Hey, I really appreciate your talk. Sorry, didn't mean to scare you. In my work with the putting the national parks collections online, we find extremely impassioned communities that are willing to help us fix any metadata or flip an image if it's the wrong way. But in my own institution, I face this constant battle of we need to watermark, we need to remove high-res downloads so people don't sell things as calendars. We need to not put this online unless the metadata is perfect. And maybe I'm just venting here, but your message really spoke to me and I appreciate it. And I don't know if you have anything to offer in terms of dealing with that.
We do. We have some kind of FAQs, some kind of written explanations on why watermarks are evil and why it's not actually such a huge problem if someone prints a calendar. with, you know, your photo? What's the, I mean, is your institution in the business of selling calendars? Is that, you know, so, you know, what's the harm? Books are for use, remember? That's our basic approach, but we do have some, you know, written case studies that show the benefit. The story I told about the German photo archive, for example, shows an unexpected side benefit of releasing your stuff that could be priceless for your institution, depending, of course, on how much attention we can get volunteers to devote to the materials you contribute. But yeah, we do have some materials like that. You can write to me and I'll share them.
Asaf, on behalf of all of us in Open Repositories on the Program Planning Committee, I want to thank you so much for being here today. You have proven yourself to be exceedingly accessible and have offered to stay after for questions. So thank you again for your really phenomenal talk. Thank you.
You're welcome. And the moose is available for selfies too.